My mom kicked me out to give my room to her boyfriend for his office. Then she sold all my stuff. What happened next shocked everyone. I need to get this off my chest because I'm watching someone I love turn into a complete stranger right before my eyes. You know how people warn you about manipulative people who somehow worm their way into relationships and completely change someone? I used to think those stories were exaggerated, maybe even made up for attention, but now I'm living through it, and I can't believe how quickly my relationship with my mom, Dana, 48, fell apart. I'm 23, and up until recently, I thought nothing in this world could come between us. I was wrong. We were incredibly close, the kind of mother-daughter duo that made people envious. But this wasn't just your typical mom's my best friend dynamic. We had something deeper, forged in the kind of tragedy that either breaks families or pulls them tighter. When my dad died 7 years ago, I was just 16, trying to survive high school while dealing with the sudden, crushing loss of my father. My mom was barely holding herself together, but somehow, we became each other's lifeline. My younger sister, Carol, who's 21 now, was there too, but she processed her grief differently. She loved us, but her way of coping was locking herself in her room, surrounded by her headphones and school books. So naturally, Mom and I gravitated toward each other even more. Over time, we developed this unspoken bond, a connection that went beyond words. I could tell what my mom was feeling just by a certain sigh, and she always knew exactly when I needed a hug, often before I realized it myself. We shared everything. Shopping trips on Saturdays, late-night ice cream runs when one of us couldn't sleep, and marathon binge sessions of trashy reality TV shows that became our silly, guilty pleasure. When it was time for me to choose a college, I picked a local university because I couldn't imagine being far from her. Then, last year, Mom started talking about dating again. It didn't catch me off guard. 7 years is a long time to be alone, and I could see the loneliness in her eyes during certain moments, watching couples stroll in the park, or during romantic scenes in her favorite movies. Carol and I were on board. We wanted Mom to be happy. My dad would have wanted that too. He was the type of person who found joy in others' happiness. At first, Mom dipped her toes back into the dating world with men she met through friends or work. Some of them seemed nice, but nothing ever stuck. She'd go on a date or two, laugh about the awkwardness over a glass of wine, and then life would carry on as usual. It became part of the routine. And then Jack happened. 3 months ago, he walked into our lives, and I swear I would give anything to go back in time and stop that first date. I had no way of knowing that this man would single-handedly destroy the beautiful relationship I had with my mother, turning our peaceful home into a war zone filled with guilt, manipulation, and resentment. From the moment I met Jack, every single instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong with him. You know how sometimes you meet someone and you just know they're bad news? That was Jack. He showed up to our house for the first time in a pair of wrinkled khakis and a shirt that looked like it had been wadded up in the corner of his car. Within minutes, he sprawled out on our couch like he owned the place. My mom introduced him with pride in her voice, but all I could see was a middle-aged loser who had somehow convinced my smart, accomplished mother that he was worth her time. The red flags were blinding. He didn't have a job, just vague excuses about being between opportunities and big claims about mysterious business ventures that were supposed to make him rich. I'm not stupid. I know what unemployed with no plans looks like, and Jack fit the definition perfectly. But I tried. I really did. I gave him a fair chance, mostly because my mom was smiling again. She hadn't smiled like that in years. Not since before my dad died. She was practically glowing, humming as she cleaned up or fixed her hair a little more often than usual. I told myself there must be something about him that I just wasn't seeing. Maybe he made her happy in ways I didn't understand. That optimism was short-lived. Jack started treating our house like his personal hotel. He'd show up unannounced, and then days later, he'd still be there, lounging on the couch, emptying our fridge, leaving beer cans everywhere like some kind of human hurricane. Mom would leave for work in the morning, and Jack would still be there, sprawled out in his pajamas, surrounded by chips and energy drinks. And he'd still be there when she came home. The only difference? there was more mess. The worst part? He'd act like cleaning up after him was Mom's job, and she'd actually do it. Here was this woman, my mom, the woman who raised 2 daughters, ran her own department at work, and kept our house in order, picking up after a grown man who contributed absolutely nothing. Over time, Jack got more and more comfortable. He claimed the prime spot on the couch. It practically molded itself to his shape. The TV constantly blared mindless reality shows, or he'd scroll TikTok videos with the volume obnoxiously high, laughing while I tried to focus on work. He never bought groceries, never chipped in for bills. But he had no problem sending Mom to the store for his favorite beer or insisting she order his preferred takeout. Every time I tried to bring it up to Mom, she'd shut me down with excuses. He's going through a rough patch, or he just needs someone to believe in him. I gave him chance after chance, praying I was wrong. But as the months dragged on, it was obvious Jack had no intention of changing. He wasn't even pretending to job hunt anymore. If anything, he doubled down on his freeloading, bragging about how he was too smart for regular jobs and how he was just waiting for the right opportunity. One evening, after I got home from work, Jack was sprawled on the couch, as usual, surrounded by his mountain of beer cans. He was rambling about his latest million-dollar idea, some ridiculous app that would revolutionize something no one cared about. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I asked him, point blank, why, if he was such a genius, he could manage to hold down even a basic job. He looked at me like I'd insulted his very existence. He launched into this long-winded, condescending speech about how the system only wants mindless drones, not visionaries like him. The irony of a man who spent his days on TikTok calling me mindless was lost on him. Then it happened. My mom came storming into the room, furious. She screamed at me for daring to question Jack. This was my mom, my best friend, my biggest supporter, now standing there defending this lazy, manipulative man like her life depended on it. I hadn't seen her raise her voice at me since I was 12, when I'd snuck out of the house. Now she was treating me like I'd committed some unforgivable crime for pointing out the truth. And Jack? He just sat there, a smug grin on his face, like he'd won some invisible game. That's when it hit me. He had won. He'd managed to drive the first real wedge between my mother and me, and the worst part was he seemed proud of it. I could see it in the smug way he smirked behind his beer can, in the way he casually slung his arm around my mom's shoulders as she lectured me about respecting him. This man, who contributed absolutely nothing to our household, had somehow convinced my own mother that I was the problem. After that fight, our house turned into a minefield. I couldn't say a single word about Jack without my mom rushing to his defense. If I pointed out that he'd left dirty dishes in the sink for days, she'd snap that I was being petty. If I mentioned he was eating the groceries I'd bought with my own paycheck, she'd accuse me of being stingy. But how could I stay quiet? This wasn't just about him being lazy anymore. I was watching this man systematically drain my mother's time, money, and energy, while she bent over backwards making excuses for him. Jack started borrowing money from her for his so-called business ventures, promising to pay her back when he hit it big. Conveniently, he'd always forget about those promises. My mom even started covering his phone bill because he claimed he needed it for networking opportunities, which apparently meant watching YouTube at full volume all day. Then came the bombshell that turned everything upside down. Jack was moving in. My mom announced it as though it were some wonderful new chapter in their relationship, but I knew the truth. He'd probably gotten kicked out of wherever he was freeloading before and needed a new place to mooch off of. Before Jack, our home ran like a well-oiled machine. It was just me and my mom most of the time, with Carol dropping by on weekends when she wasn't busy with college. Mom and I had our routine. We split everything down the middle: rent, utilities, groceries, household supplies. At the beginning of each month, we'd sit down, go over the bills, and figure out who owed what. It worked perfectly. But Jack's arrival wrecked everything. Suddenly, the grocery bill doubled, yet the number of contributors stayed the same. This man could tear through a week's worth of food in a matter of days. He drank all the coffee I bought for my morning commute, hogged the hot water with his hour-long showers, and left every single light in the house blazing while he binge-watched TV. Our utility bills skyrocketed because Jack spent all day at home blasting the AC and keeping his endless parade of devices plugged in. And did he ever offer to pay for any of it? Of course not. Jack acted like paying bills was beneath him, as if his very existence in our home was some kind of blessing we should be grateful for. What stung the most was watching my mom struggle with the increased expenses while Jack behaved like it was his divine right to live off our hard work. I was essentially subsidizing this grown man's entire lifestyle. Half of what I paid toward bills and groceries went to keeping him comfortable. I'd come home from work to find my meal prep containers empty because Jack had helped himself to my food. More than once, I caught him using my laptop because his phone had died, without even asking. I kept hoping that living with us full-time would push Jack to change. Maybe the responsibility of being in our home would force him to get his act together. Maybe Mom would finally see how much of a burden he was and give him an ultimatum. But I was being naive. Moving in only made Jack more comfortable in his parasitic lifestyle. He started spreading his belongings everywhere, turning the living room into his office for his fake business ventures. He even had the audacity to complain about the brand of coffee we bought, suggesting Mom get the expensive kind he preferred, with her money, of course. Meanwhile, I watched my savings dwindle. I wasn't just paying to support myself and help my mom, I was footing the bill for him, too. Every morning at 7:30 a.m., I'd leave for work, stepping over his mess in the living room where he'd be passed out on the couch, surrounded by empty beer cans and snack wrappers. When I came home at 5:30 p.m., it was like a scene from a twisted time loop. Jack would be in the exact same spot, maybe slouched slightly to the left, but now with more trash littering the floor. The TV would be blaring some mind-numbing reality show, and he'd barely acknowledge me except to ask when Mom would be home, probably so she could pick up more beer. The worst part was seeing my mom come home, exhausted after a long day of work, only to immediately start cleaning up after him like she was his personal maid. She'd pick up his beer bottles, wash his dishes, and even do his laundry when he finally decided to change clothes after wearing the same thing for days. It was unbearable. I hit my breaking point after a particularly bad day. I came home to find he'd dirted every single dish in the kitchen, making himself one of his infamous snacks. I decided enough was enough. It was time to have a serious conversation with my mom. I waited for the right moment. A Saturday morning when Jack was still passed out, sleeping off his Friday night drinking binge. Saturday mornings used to be our thing. Mom and I would have coffee together, just the two of us. Jack had mostly ruined that tradition, but this time, I managed to catch her alone. I had everything planned out. I calmly showed her our utility bills from before and after Jack moved in. They had nearly doubled. I laid out our grocery receipts, pointing out how we were spending more, but somehow had less food. I explained, as gently as I could, how it hurt to see her working so hard while Jack contributed nothing. I reminded her that my contributions were now covering his lifestyle, too. The moment her expression hardened, I knew this wasn't going to end well. She immediately got defensive. Instead of addressing what I'd said, she tried to deflect by bringing up Carol. "It's not fair," she argued. "You never complain about Carol not contributing financially." I was stunned. Carol? My sister, who was a full-time student and only came home on weekends. Carol, who always cleaned up after herself, helped with groceries, and even fixed things around the house during her breaks? How could my mom even compare my responsible, thoughtful sister to Jack? I spent the next hour trying to reason with her. I showed her bank statements, broke down household expenses, and pointed out how Jack's presence had disrupted not just our finances, but our entire relationship. I appealed to the logical side of her, the side that had always taught me about financial responsibility and self-respect. But it was like talking to a brick wall. Every point I made was met with defensiveness or accusations that I was being selfish and unsupportive. This wasn't just one conversation either. Over the next few weeks, I tried everything. I brought it up when she was in a good mood, during our rare shopping trips when Jack wasn't tagging along, even once when she mentioned worrying about money. Each time, I thought, maybe this is the moment she'll see reason. I gathered job listings for Jack, researched resume templates, and even offered to help him write one. Not that he'd ever accept my help. But every attempt ended the same way, Mom shutting me down and insisting their relationship wasn't my business, even though his presence was turning my life upside down. The final conversation was the one that destroyed everything. I'd just gotten home from work to find Jack sprawled on the couch, as usual, surrounded by his mess. My mom was in the kitchen cooking dinner for him, of course. I decided to try one last time to make her understand. The moment I brought up Jack's unemployment and his freeloading, my mom completely lost it. This wasn't just anger. It was like 7 months of Jack's manipulation poured out all at once. He'd managed to drive the first real wedge between my mother and me, and he was proud of it. I could see it in his smug smirk behind his beer can, in the way he lazily slung his arm around my mom's shoulders while she lectured me about respecting him. The man who did absolutely nothing for our home had somehow convinced my mother that I was the problem. After that, our house felt like walking through a minefield. I couldn't say a single thing about Jack without Mom leaping to his defense. If I pointed out that he'd left dirty dishes in the sink for days, she'd snap that I was being petty. If I mentioned that he was eating food I had paid for, she'd accuse me of being stingy. But I couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about laziness anymore. I was watching this man systematically drain my mother's resources while she made excuse after excuse for him. Then came the moment that shattered everything. She told me I needed to move out. It happened during one particularly heated argument. Mom accused me of trying to ruin her chance at happiness. She said I was being selfish, controlling, and immature, that I couldn't handle seeing her with someone new. According to her, I was just a jealous daughter who wanted to keep her mother lonely forever. I stood there, speechless, as she threw accusation after accusation at me, things that clearly didn't come from her. Apparently, Jack had been feeding her stories about how I treated him. He claimed I was constantly hostile, that I slammed doors when he was around, muttered rude comments under my breath, and glared at him every chance I got. The truth? I mostly ignore him because I couldn't bear to watch him take advantage of my mother. But Jack had spun this elaborate story, painting himself as the innocent victim and me as the villain, and my mom believed every word of it. What hurt the most was how easily she accepted his lies. This was my mother, the woman who'd known me my entire life, my best friend, my confidant. And yet, after just 7 months, she was choosing to believe a lazy, unemployed freeloader over her own daughter. Every time I tried to defend myself, to explain that Jack was lying, she'd cut me off with another accusation. It was like arguing with a stranger who just happened to be wearing my mother's face. Then came the words that felt like a knife to my chest. If you can't learn to accept Jack and be nice to him, you need to move out. Just like that, she chose him over me. We had a plan. I was supposed to stay until March, until my 24th birthday. Mom and I had worked it all out together. I had just started my first real job out of college, and the pay wasn't much. We agreed that staying at home to save up was the smartest financial decision. But now, in November, with barely any savings and winter around the corner, she was throwing me out because I wouldn't play nice with her freeloading boyfriend. The worst part? This was exactly what Jack wanted. In just 7 months, he turned my mom against me so completely that she was willing to toss her own daughter out into the cold. Years of love, trust, and shared struggles meant nothing compared to the lies of a man who contributed nothing but empty promises and beer cans to our home. I'd been replaced by someone who didn't even know her favorite flower or how she liked her coffee in the morning. The more my mom spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't spontaneous. She had all these responses ready, and she used phrases that sounded suspiciously like something Jack would say. It was obvious they discussed this, planned this. When I brought up our agreement about March, she dismissed it like it was nothing. Like all our careful planning for my future had been erased the moment Jack decided he wanted my room. And the excuses she gave me? They were almost worse than the eviction itself. According to her, I was too old to be living at home, even though just a few months ago, she'd been the one insisting I stay and save money. She said I needed to grow up and take responsibility for myself. Rich words coming from someone supporting a grown man who spent his days watching TikTok videos on full volume. Every time I tried to reason with her, she shut me down. I showed her my bank account, proving I didn't have enough saved for first and last month's rent, let alone a security deposit. I reminded her how expensive apartments were in our area and how I'd probably have to move to a less safe neighborhood or somewhere much further from my job. I even appealed to her maternal instincts, trying to explain how hard it would be for me to suddenly move out with no preparation. But it was like talking to a wall. She had an answer for everything, and none of those answers involved concern for my well-being. Then came the final nail in the coffin, the proof that this was Jack's plan all along. Jack needs an office for his business ventures, she announced, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. The room I'd lived in since we moved into this house was going to become an office for a man who hadn't worked a day in his life. He needed my space for his imaginary business, and my mother was perfectly fine with displacing her own daughter to accommodate his delusions. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty Jack had orchestrated this. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the mother I knew anymore. My mom, the strong, resilient woman who'd always been my biggest supporter, would never have put a man she barely knew ahead of her own child. But somehow, Jack had rewritten everything. In just a few months, I went from being her daughter, her confidant, her best friend, to an inconvenience, a problem standing in the way of Jack's comfort. I've always believed that begging someone to want you strips away any dignity you have left. Standing there, looking at my mother, I knew no amount of pleading or reasoning would change her mind. Jack had poisoned her against me, and I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down or beg to stay. I was certain of one thing. He had won. He would have loved that. He would have used it as more ammunition to paint me as the immature daughter who couldn't let go. So I didn't beg. I didn't plead. I just looked my mother in the eye and asked her, one last time, if this was really what she wanted. When she said yes, without a second hesitation, I felt the last thread of our relationship snap. I had to take time off work, time I couldn't really afford, to search for apartments. Every empty studio I viewed was a stark reminder of how unprepared I was for this. I'd been saving responsibly, helping with bills, and planning for a careful transition in March. But now, in November, I was scrambling to find anywhere that would take a tenant with barely enough savings to cover a security deposit. Carol was incredible during that time. She skipped classes to help me pack, called apartments for me while I was at work, and even tried to reason with Mom. But it didn't matter. Mom had made her choice, and that choice was Jack. I eventually found a tiny studio apartment in a neighborhood I'd always hoped to avoid. It was one of those places where you can hear your neighbors' conversations through the paper-thin walls, and the water pressure is a joke. The landlord took pity on me after I explained my situation and let me split the security deposit into 2 payments. Moving in was depressing. My furniture barely fit. The walls were a sickly beige color I wasn't allowed to paint over, and the entire place smelled faintly of old carpet. But at least it was mine. I didn't have to see Jack sprawled across my couch or listen to him ramble about his latest get-rich-quick scheme anymore. Those first few weeks were the hardest. I would stare at my phone, wondering if today would be the day my mom would realize what she'd done, that she'd seen through Jack's manipulation and wanted me to come home. I even rehearsed in my head what I would say when she called to apologize. But the call never came. Days turned into weeks, and my phone remained silent. No texts asking if I was okay. No calls to check on me. Not even a message to see if I'd settled into my new place. The mother who used to text me multiple times a day, just to share a funny meme or check in, had vanished. It was like the moment I moved out, I stopped existing to her. Carol would visit me and avoid talking about Mom as much as possible, but I could see it on her face. Things at home weren't good. She'd get this guilty look whenever she mentioned being at the house, like she felt bad for still maintaining a relationship with both of us. But the message was clear. Mom had chosen Jack over me, and she was sticking to that choice. Update 1. Life after being kicked out became an exercise in rebuilding myself from scratch. I picked up extra shifts whenever I could and tried to make my sterile little studio apartment feel like a home. About 2 weeks after moving in, I hit rock bottom. I broke down and called Mom, hoping maybe she'd been wanting to reach out but didn't know how. The phone rang and rang before eventually going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What could I even say? Hey, Mom, just wondering if you care that your daughter is barely scraping by because you chose your deadbeat boyfriend over her. I waited for days, thinking surely she'd call back just to check why I'd reached out. Nothing. The woman who used to panic if I didn't answer her texts within an hour couldn't be bothered to return my call. My sister stepped up. Carol became my rock during that time. She spent almost every weekend at my place, bringing home-cooked meals and helping me settle into living alone. She hung up pictures, brought little decorations, and tried to make my cold, sterile studio feel less lonely. But she was also my unwilling link to what was happening back at home, and what she told me made me realize just how completely Jack had won. They didn't waste a second erasing me from the house. Within days of me leaving, they'd cleared out my room entirely. The space I'd lived in for years, where I cried over my first breakup, studied for exams, and processed my father's death, was turned into Jack's office. Carol said they painted over my carefully chosen wall color with some ugly beige Jack had picked out, replaced my furniture with a rickety desk he'd found on Facebook Marketplace, and set it up like some pathetic executive suite. But the worst part, the absolute gut punch, was what they did with my belongings. The things I'd left behind, stuff I couldn't move on short notice or fit into my tiny studio, were gone. My mother had sold them like they meant nothing. My old bookshelf, the one Dad and I had put together when I was a teenager, sold. The winter clothes I'd been planning to come back for, gone to some stranger on Facebook Marketplace. Even my box of high school memorabilia, photos, yearbooks, little keepsakes from that time in my life, was either sold off or thrown away. Carol said it happened over a single weekend, like some kind of erase all traces of my daughter yard sale. And the money? Every dollar Mom made went straight to Jack for his latest investment opportunity. My childhood memories were liquidated to fund whatever scam had caught Jack's eye that week. The betrayal was so sharp it felt impossible to process. This wasn't just about getting rid of old stuff. It was my mother systematically erasing any evidence that I'd ever lived in that house. After hearing about the yard sale, I had to tell Carol to stop updating me on what was happening at home. Every new piece of information reopened a wound I was trying desperately to let heal. I needed to move on, to focus on building my own life. Mom had made her choice crystal clear. Jack was her priority now, and I was just a closed chapter of her life. Fine. If she could forget about me so easily, I had to learn to do the same. The months after my forced exodus became a crash course in adult survival. I picked up as many extra shifts as I could, learned how to stretch cheat meals for days, and became an expert at finding free entertainment. My little apartment slowly transformed from an emergency shelter into something resembling a home. The biggest breakthrough came when I landed a new job at a marketing firm. It wasn't my dream role, but it came with better health insurance and a salary bump. For the first time since that awful November night, I could finally start building an emergency fund instead of living paycheck to paycheck. I even started looking into online classes to boost my qualifications. Then came the day karma finally made an appearance. Carol showed up at my apartment one Sunday afternoon, looking nervous. She had that same guilty expression she used to wear as a kid when she had to fess up about a bad grade. "I know you said you didn't want updates about Mom," she began, fidgeting with her phone, "but I think you need to hear this." The fact that Carol, who had respected my no mom updates rule for months, felt compelled to break it told me this was serious. According to Carol, Mom had done something she'd never done before. She'd asked to borrow money from her. Not a small amount either. She needed help covering utility bills that were past due. Mom had tried to play it off casually, like it was just a brief loan until her next paycheck. But Carol's alarm bells went off. Our mom had always been proud of providing for us. She worked hard to make sure we never went without. And now, she was asking her college-age daughter, who worked part-time at a campus bookstore, for money. When Carol pressed her for details, the full extent of the financial disaster started to come to light. Without my financial contributions, Mom was struggling to keep up with household expenses, but the real issue was Jack. She wasn't just supporting herself anymore. She was funding his endless stream of get-rich-quick schemes. He had convinced her to pour money into everything from cryptocurrency to dropshipping businesses, and even some pyramid scheme disguised as marketing. Every paycheck brought a new opportunity that needed just a little more cash to take off. Carol painted the full picture for me. Jack hadn't just manipulated my mother into kicking me out, he'd done it to gain complete control of her finances. With me gone, no one was left to question where all her money was going. Selling my belongings was just the beginning. Now, he had direct access to her paycheck and was bleeding her dry. Carol begged me to reach out to Mom, hoping she'd finally listen. I tried calling, but predictably it went straight to voicemail. Carol wouldn't give up, though. One night, while we were eating dinner, she handed me her phone mid-conversation. "Mom, someone wants to talk to you," she said. The moment Mom heard my voice, the line went dead silent. I kept my tone neutral as I explained I'd heard about the financial trouble and was concerned. But before I could finish, she exploded. She screamed that I was bitter and jealous, that I couldn't stand seeing her happy, that Jack had shown her what real love looked like. Her words were venomous, and I could hear Jack in the background, feeding her lines like some twisted ventriloquist. The final straw came when she said Jack was more family than I had ever been. I ended the call. Carol sat there, tears streaming down her face, apologizing for pushing me to make the call. She'd believed Mom might finally listen, but nothing had changed. Mom's loyalties were still with Jack, and I couldn't keep throwing myself against a wall hoping for a different result. Life settled into a new normal. Carol became a constant in my life, visiting every weekend, bringing groceries, and helping me make my tiny apartment feel like home. We grew closer than ever, ironically bonded by the fallout of Mom's choices. Months later, Mom finally reached out, desperate. Jack had convinced her to invest in a cryptocurrency scam, draining not only her savings but maxing out credit cards, loans, and even her 401k. She was drowning in debt, but somehow, she still defended Jack, claiming he lost money too. I refused to help her. I told her she had made her choices that led to this disaster. She had kicked me out, sold my belongings, and handed everything to Jack. She had chosen him over me, and now she had to face the consequences. Her response was predictable: guilt trips, excuses, and blame. Somehow, in her warped reality, it was still my fault. I was the ungrateful daughter who hadn't stayed silent and kept contributing to the household. I hung up on her and ignored every call that followed. Since then, Mom has tried to reach out through mutual friends, messages, and different numbers, but I've learned my lesson. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. My life isn't perfect, but it's mine. My apartment may be small, but nobody can take it away from me. My job may not be ideal, but I'm building a future on my own terms. I found peace in knowing I did everything I could, and now I'm free from the weight of trying to protect someone who doesn't want to be saved.